It is always a pleasure to catch up with my next guest. From what the OCR is doing to misbehaving MPs in the Beehive and beyond, he covers it all. Ashley Church, market and political commentator. Ash, how are you?
I'm good, Leah, but I have to say I've invested recently in a better camera for these video interviews, and I've noticed as I'm doing these pre-intros that I've got a shiny head and a lot less hair on it. So I like the days when we did it by phone.
Oh no, you look great. You see, that's the thing.
Yeah.
When the cameras are really, really, the latest, they show up everything.
It's not good. You want to go back to the 40s when they had that sort of soft, romantic
yes.
look.
Like a little bit of Vaseline across the lens, and we all looked wistful and kind
That's
of
the one.
Here's just a little bit of a clue for me, Ash. So I have like a powder that I
okay.
So because like my forehead takes up quite a bit of real estate, so I too can get shiny. So there we go. There's just a little.
Nice.
There's my tips. I'll send you some powder. Okay, right. Let's get serious. Let's start, Ashley, with the wait time. I thought this was an interesting story. The wait time to process a home loan application. Mortgage brokers say banks are taking much longer to process them, and new loans are stuck in limbo for about 5 to 10 business days. Firstly, is that a long time? And what's slowing them down, do you think?
Well, it's a long time. It depends. If you're getting an approval prior to going out and checking out what's on the market in order to buy, then it probably doesn't matter too much. It's not the end of the world. If you're in the process of having made an offer and you've gone to the bank to get an approval, it's part of that, particularly if you've given a commitment during the conditional period to get that approval prior to going unconditional, then it could be a long time. It could be fingernail biting stuff. But it's interesting because I kind of don't always say this, but I kind of have some sympathy with the banks on this. And the reason is we've had a pretty quiet 2 or 3 years, in fact, nearly 4 years in the property market. So we haven't had a lot of business being done, certainly not at the levels that we were doing pre-2021. And so from the bank's perspective, I suspect what you'll find is that they have downgraded the capacity to process loans because the business hasn't justified the numbers that they used to have. It's now starting to look like it's going to track up again. I think it's gone up 15% more house sales since this time last year. The banks will be hesitant to increase that capacity too soon because there's been so much volatility in the market over the last 2 or 3 years that they would be fearing that they increase the headcount in order to process things quicker, and then suddenly the market falls away again. So I kind of have some sympathy with what they're doing.
Yeah. Some lenders are promising 24-hour decisions for direct applicants. Does that create a bit of a, unfair advantage to those who don't use brokers?
For those who don't or do?
Oh, do. Sorry, don't.
Yeah.
Do?
Yeah. So, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it becomes a competitive advantage in its own right. So if you've got banks saying, hey, look, we'll do this, then you're going to have people saying, well, the likelihood is, though, that most people will go to their existing bank. So there's not a huge amount of people out there who are shopping around with. So for those people who are in the fortuitous position where they can choose which bank they're going to go to, great. That's one of the things that might help them to consider going to one bank over another. But remember, there's other things too, like the interest rates and the deal that the bank's going to do and all that stuff. But for the majority of us, it's particularly those who are buying and selling a previous home, then it's likely that you're going to return that with the existing bank. So that's probably not going to make a hell of a lot of difference.
Yeah. The government's giving itself new powers, I see, Ash, under the Resource Management Act to override local councils when they're planning decisions they say get in the way of economic growth, housing development or job creation. This move is meant to be a short-term fix until sweeping RMA reforms kick in around 2027. Firstly, do you think it's fair for the government to override councils?
I'm a bit ambivalent on this because on the one hand, you could argue, what about local democracy and the ability of local communities to make their own decisions? But I understand, because this is Chris Bishop, I understand his frustration. So the major reason for doing this is because you've got councils around the country that are basically passing the buck on housing development. So they're putting it into the too hard basket and essentially setting it aside and making it a problem either for a future council or for another community. And what he's basically saying is, no, you're not going to be able to do that. By the way, this is an echo of the likelihood that this is going to be a permanent legislative requirement under the new RMA when it comes out in 2027. So this is just a quick fix for something that I think is going to be more common going forward. The only comment I would make in the other, because I talked before about communities needing to have some sort of local decision making process, and I still agree with that. The problem you've got, of course, is that if you look around the country, our local government in a lot of cases is in chaos. You look at what's happened in Wellington, which is obviously the poster child for chaos in local government, but you've got various councils around the country that are taking on themselves projects that probably aren't in the best interest of the long-term development of their communities, instead of focusing on things like underground infrastructure, housing, and some of that other stuff that most of us would argue is probably more important for local government. So as I say, I have a lot of sympathy for what Bishop's doing, and look, he's doing this now, so this is going to happen, and it's going to be a long-term thing once that new act comes in.
I was going to say that, but he says it's a stopgap, right, until the bigger RMA Act comes in, like you said. I always think though, give temporary powers to someone, and possibly it does set a kind of a long-term precedent.
Yeah, and that's the bit where I sort of struggled about whether I'm going to say what I'm about to say or not, but I will. So I'm a little bit biased in this because I am a bit partisan in the sense that I'm a lot more trusting of a national government doing this than I am of a Labor government. If this was Labor proposing to do this, I would be much more cautious. And the reason for that is because National tends to be, whether you like them or not as a government, they tend to be focused on doing stuff which is about growing the economy and growing communities. Labor tends to be much more about ideology and woke stuff. So if this was Labor saying, hey, we're going to impose powers on councils, as they were proposing to do with Three Waters, that wasn't that long ago.
Let's not forget that.
I think there would be more upset in our communities. This is likely to go through without too much debate.
Regional house prices are starting to pull ahead of the main centres. In May, nationwide values dipped in the three main centres, but smaller places like Rotorua, New Plymouth, Hastings all saw month-on-month gains. So, Ash, do you think this reflects stronger rural and provincial economies, especially those buoyed, say, by farming?
Yeah, there's two or three reasons I can think of for this. And of course, and let's just to put this in perspective, because we tend to treat this as cities versus regions. In fact, if you broke down the country, you would find that there would be much more variation than that headline tends to suggest. But let's assume that it is a city versus a region thing. There are at least three reasons I can think of. The first one, as you say, is that regional economies are doing pretty well at the moment. They're getting good commodity prices and recovering perhaps a little more quickly than the cities are. So that's obviously having an impact on house prices. The second one is they're just becoming more attractive. And I think you and I have talked about this before, but if you look at what's happened since 2020 with the advent of Zoom and Teams meetings and some of these other technologies where people can live and work in regional centres and deal with their staff and their businesses in the main centres, that's becoming a really big temptation for a lot of people. So that's impacting. And the third one is, and this is just a practical thing, if you assume that the market's starting to pick up, and there's some suggestion that it is, we talked in that earlier item about 15% more houses being sold this year than this time last year, then in pure dollar terms, if you're looking at a house for 500, 600,000, as you are in some parts of New Zealand, versus a house for $1 million or 1.5 million, it's easier to increase your offer a little bit on a house worth 750,000 than it is on a house worth 1.5 million, and just in really simple terms. So that also explains why there's a bit more creep in these early stages in regional house prices than there is in some of those city prices. Yeah,
no, I think you're right. I think the regions are actually just becoming, more not palatable. That's the wrong word, but attractive. They just become.
And that's a good thing. That's a great thing. That's good for the country.
Oh, I'd love to get out into the country somewhere, but the new global I thought this was interesting. The new global rental snapshot. This is from realestate.co.nz. Auckland's average weekly rent has hit 750, right? Melbourne 745. So we
it's like a
so are we officially in ridiculous territory, or is this just new normal for big cities?
In terms of those prices?
Well, I mean, how can Auckland be higher than Melbourne, for goodness sake?
Well, it's interesting because I have a slightly different perspective. And when you look at those numbers, because what you haven't quoted is Sydney, which has an average rental of 983.
Yeah.
Or Brisbane at
Brisbane.
1,161.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So Melbourne and Auckland are basking in relatively cheap rentals by comparison, and that $5 is, one latte per week. So I've always looked at Sydney, Melbourne, and Auckland as being the three major cities of the South Pacific. So there's that kind of triangle of those three cities, and between the three of them, so I do regard it in the same breath as I regard those other two. And the fact that Melbourne and Auckland are keeping the rentals so much lower than Sydney, I think it's a pretty positive thing. That's good company. Melbourne's a great city, so Sydney, to be fair.
City. Yeah.
We're at the lower end of that. That's great for Kiwis, and as long as we are maintaining the lifestyle that we have in Auckland, but we're keeping those rents down, that's good for Kiwis.
Christchurch also came in lower, and Christchurch is lovely, 575. I think that's not bad. All right, Ashley, put your political pants on now, or your hat, or whichever you put on for this.
My pants normally, but they're on at the moment.
Put your pants on nice. We've got to start with Israel and Iran. The 12-day conflict between the two ended in a ceasefire that took effect June 24, mediated by the US and Qatar. Both nations have publicly agreed to honour it, but for how long? Despite the agreement, there's been reports of minor violations, some missile launches intercepted by Israel and Israeli strikes into Iran's airspace. But overall, the truce seems intact. And leaders on both sides, including Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, have described the ceasefire as a fragile pause, even calling it a victory while pointing to remaining tensions. I mean, Ash, what's the likelihood it will hold?
Nil. So, nil.
Okay, moving on. No.
There's a few moving parts to this, though. So let's remember why this has happened.